Diaz is a sprightly soldier in the company of the Cordacista expedition. At 29 years old, his birth in 1492 coincides with the Spanish era of exploration. In this way, Diaz has and will act as a living record of his kingdom's exploits in these lands. His word will become a historical guidepost in the future, as he writes his memoirs that put him at the center of everything that has happened in these turbulent years. But for now, that is still the future. Right now, he and his company march in a disorderly procession up the southern causeway toward the mythical Tenochtitlan. As he marches with his fellow soldiers, he cannot help but notice that hundreds, if not thousands, of naturales, who have come out of their houses and piled in canoes and along branching causeways to gawk at these strangers from a strange land, stare at him, fixated. Diaz finds himself gripping and releasing the hilt of his sword in anxious rhythms, uncertain of what is to come. The Spanish have approached the threshold of this great floating city and have been invited to meet its master, Moctezuma. What will come of the meeting, Diaz does not know. It has been a long year of attempting to divine destiny and destination. Diaz, like all his compatriots, is battered, bruised, and scabbed over with flesh wounds burned in the fat of dead indigenous enemies. But up ahead of the procession he sees his captain, as sure of himself as ever in his pompous strides, and beyond him hundreds more naturales, caciques among them, and feels guided by the hand of God and the hunger for wealth to continue on in his quest. The morning sun beats down on Diaz. Sweat drips along his back. The meeting of two worlds is about to commence, and Bernal Diaz will be its witness. Hello, and welcome to Can't Go Back, Won't Move On, a paranoid historical storytelling podcast dedicated to seeing the history of the Americas from within the visions of the people who lived it. I'm your host, Gavrilo Z. Last week, we followed Xicotencat, the Prince of Tlaxcala who bitterly opposed his Altepet's alliance with the Spanish. After the initial war between the Spaniards and the Tlaxcalans, Cortés, through his translator Malintzin, was able to make contact with the Council of Tlaxcala and propose an anti-Mexica alliance that would march on Tenochtitlan. In the traditional narrative of the conquest, this is seen as the moment when Spanish diplomacy begins to truly win out and seize an opportunity in the division between indigenous groups across Mesoamerica. In this version of the story, Cortés, always with the silver tongue, is able to promise the right rewards for Tlaxcalan cooperation and fully master the diplomacy necessary to create such an alliance. But weakened from their battles with the Tlaxcalans and unsure of their surroundings and vague on the politics of Mesoamerica, the Spanish in actuality were utterly adrift, paranoid and desperate to secure the cooperation of the Tlaxcalans by any means necessary, undermining their positions as masters of their own fate. As they continued on toward Tenochtitlan, it became necessary to wonder, were the Spaniards marching toward the city on the island, or were they being led there? In this episode, we will finally follow the Spanish approach to Tenochtitlan and their long, strange residency in the city, which struck a delicate balance between the Spanish being bold conquerors and disoriented captives of Moctezuma, in one of the most hotly contested periods of this era in history. We will see this period primarily through the eyes of conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo, the famed chronicler of so many Spanish adventures in the Americas, and a man whose own memoirs are a collaboration in the conspiracy of Spanish history. Let us now turn our attention to Bernal Diaz and that conspiracy and the occupation of Tenochtitlan in this week's episode of Can't Go Back, Won't Move On, a paranoid historical storytelling podcast where history isn't a story repeating, but a conspiracy unfolding. Episode 1.11, Bernal Diaz, Tenochtitlan, and the Conspiracy of History. Bernal Diaz, in his own perspective, was the great witness to the early Spanish Empire in the Americas. Before arriving in the Caribbean, he lived an unexceptional early life as a minor noble, attending school with his brother and becoming literate at a time when the invention of the printing press was making mass literature possible for the first time in European history. He grew up fascinated by chivalric tales of heroism, like that of Amadis de Gaula, one of the most famous stories of the day in which a knight conquers his enemies and falls in love. And he made repeated references to this novel in his later memoirs. In 1510, at 18 years old, Bernal Diaz set out to the New World aboard one of the 19 ships bound for a new Spanish colony in what is modern-day Darien, Panama. The expedition was 1,500 people, and the largest such to the New World at that time. It proved to be disastrous, with over half of the settlers dying in the first seasons of the expedition to disease and famine. Diaz's youthful romanticism of adventure turned to horror as infighting between leaders caused deep and deeper divisions in the community and led to a power struggle that ended with one colonial leader executing his rival after a show trial in one of the most infamous breakdowns of Spanish law in the colonies. Disillusioned, Diaz set off for Cuba to try his hand at a more established colony, where a distant relative of his, our old friend Diego de Velázquez, was governor. He spent the next several years toiling away in Cuba, attempting to make a fortune for himself in this new land. Showing an aptitude for language learning he would carry throughout his life, he was one of the few Spaniards who learned Taíno and was able to converse with the indigenous. He would later learn Nahuatl and one of the Maya languages of Guatemala, where he would serve as governor in his later life. According to Diaz in his own later memoirs, he was a part of both the Córdoba and Grijalva expeditions to the Yucatan in 1517 and 1518, respectively. At the time of the Cortés expedition, he was in his mid-20s, a typical age for the conquistadores of this mission, though it did put him on the younger side of the average. He was not one of the privileged captains of Cortés, but came to know the man well over the next decade. As the months and then years of the campaign rolled on, Diaz writes of himself as one of the more trusted soldiers in the company. When writing of pivotal moments in the Spanish conquest of Mexico, Diaz always seems to put himself close at hand to the action. But his famed memoirs weren't written until decades after the events in question. It was a project that he undertook on and off for the rest of his life, revising and expanding them as both genuine effort at historical recollection and also as something of a personal axe to grind. Diaz, though never fully repentant of his role in the conquest, would come to view both the conquest and its legacy ambivalently. No small part of this was due to the way that the slow, weathering crawl of time sanded away the contributions of others, until all that was left was the myth of Cortés somehow single-handedly overthrowing an empire. Diaz specifically detested the work of Francisco López de Gómara, Cortés's chaplain and biographer. He felt that Gómara valorized Cortés at the expense of so many other conquistadores. This is despite the fact that an analysis of Diaz's own memoirs shows that he borrows liberally from the writings of Gómara. But Diaz was no revisionist either. As the Spanish friars came to Mexico and began documenting the Nahuatl people's own telling of their history, Diaz objected. In particular, he despised Bernardino de Sahagun's ethnography of the Mexica and other Mesoamerican peoples, a people he believed to be heathens by nature and in need of Christianity, a mission that he believed to have been of the utmost importance in the conquest. As he would infamously write in his memoirs, he, like all other conquistadores, came to Mexico to serve God and to get rich. Second only to Cortés's Cartas de Relación in terms of historical importance, Bernal Diaz's true history of the conquest of New Spain relates what happened during those pivotal years in exacting detail. Diaz's account differs by writing in the first-person plural, using we whenever possible to emphasize that the Spanish conquest was not, in fact, the result of the heroic efforts of one man, but a collective effort. He is, of course, correct in that revision of history. But, as might be expected, his narrative still falls short of being a perfect account of the event, one that the late historian Hugh Thomas has commented on, that on occasion Bernal Diaz's memory is at fault, turns out to be a classic British understatement in the assessment of historian Matthew Restall. The memory at fault can be attributed to age or remove. His original manuscript runs over 1,000 pages and was not published until 1632, over 100 years after the conquest. Diaz himself died 50 years prior in the 1580s. But not all of Diaz's errors can be written off so innocently, and his memoirs turn out to be an active co-conspirator in the fabrication of history out of the fugue of memory, a deliberate smudging of the ledger details that leave the truth open to interpretation, interpreting those ink blots smeared across its page. See what you will in these images, the truth remains relative and unknowable in the hands of men like Diaz. And we left Diaz and his other conquistadores outside the massacre of Cholula. Paranoid and agitated by their Tlaxcalan allies that something was amiss, the Spaniards committed an atrocity against the innocent Cholulan people. But after the massacre of Cholula, there was nothing stopping the combined forces of the Spanish and Tlaxcalan from entering the Valley of Mexico and marching down toward Lake Texcoco on the way into Tenochtitlan. 5 months after leaving Veracruz and the Gulf Coast, Cortés and his captains were far more resolute than ever to enter the city at the heart of the Central Valley, though what kind of reception they would receive once in there, they couldn't be sure. Plenty of their allies along the way, including the Tlaxcalans and Totonacs, had warned the Spanish not to enter the city, as Diaz notes, because once inside they would be trapped and unable to escape the island connected to the mainland by fewer than a half-dozen causeways, all of which were engineered with numerous bridges which could be hauled up to interrupt the path forward and allow for the passage of canoes between them. The march from Cholula into the Valley of Mexico was not without its difficulties. The climb in altitude from the Gulf Coast is a serious one, with the elevation of Tenochtitlan reaching over 2,000 meters above sea level. The air was cold and thin, and the Spaniards, as well as the remainder of their Taino and African servants, found themselves adjusting with great difficulty. As Buddy Levy writes in Conquistador, quote, "They lurched slowly up through the timbered foothills and then into the higher mountains. Men, sickened by the great heights such as they had never before encountered, bent at the waist, coughing and gasping for air. The horses stumbled up the rocky trails, heaving and wheezing." Unquote. Diaz, as with the others, was fatigued and found morale difficult to summon in these miserable months. But as they crested the last mountains and peered down into the Central Valley, the sight before them amazed everyone. Ringed with mountains and volcanoes that gave way to a basin and an enormous series of lakes at the bottom of a temperate, highly biodiverse environment, the conquistadores marveled at what they witnessed. Off in this distance, ringing the Great Lake, were a series of enormous cities, houses which gleamed like silver with their whitewashed limestone construction, enormous pyramids and other ceremonial structures, great ball courts distributed throughout cities that were laid out in beautifully grid-like systems which honored the cardinal orientation of the universe. And right in the middle of the lake lay the grandest city of them all, Tenochtitlan Tlatelolco, twin cities of the Mexica which dominated the entire region. Enormous, fanciful, and connected by those causeways, it looked every bit the impregnable fortress on the lake that it was reported to be to the Spaniards. The sight was so magnificent that Diaz, writing one of his most famous passages in his memoir, wrote, quote, "We were astounded. These great towns and pyramids and buildings rising from the water, all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision from the tale of Amadis. Indeed, some of our soldiers asked whether it was not all a dream. It was all so wonderful that I do not know how to describe this first glimpse of things never heard of, seen, or dreamed before." Unquote. Diaz and his company would have found themselves approaching a city of hundreds of thousands of people, a staggering figure beyond their experience and imagination. Since its founding 200 years ago, Tenochtitlan had risen from a miserable mud brick island home amidst a putrid lake into what was now an Oz-like wonder that ranked among the world's most luxurious. It was also, as the Spaniards would come to see firsthand, brilliantly engineered. Laid out in the typical four-quadrant style of many Mesoamerican cities, it housed 4 distinct districts in its northeast, southeast, southwest, and northeast quadrants, each of them with their own Capultan families which governed them. The famous Chapultepec 2-channel aqueduct system had been rebuilt into one made of stone and one whose water could be alternated between channels to allow for cleaning, bringing fresh water from the hill where the Mexica had once been massacred. Canals crisscrossed throughout the city, allowing for the transportation of canoe to haul goods and people throughout. Cleaners were employed to sweep and maintain the city streets every day. The Mexica used their water resources to have plenty of potable water from which to drink and bathe, and had the famous Temescal steam houses, which were used to help anyone ill to sweat out the diseases which afflicted them. Privies were built to allow for privacy and the intentional disposal of human waste using the currents of the canal. Human sewage was also gathered in canoes and used for the purpose of tanning hides. It was brilliant, efficient, and astounded the Spaniards as they entered it, being cleaner and more neatly organized than anything they were used to in their cramped, filthy Spanish cities, even the grandest ones such as Seville. But it would take the expedition several days to reach the city, however, as they trekked down into the valley with their party of thousands, including Spaniards, Africans, Taino, some remaining Tlaxcalans, and Totonac, toward the capital which they sought. During this time, they stayed in a few cities along the way, where people of the empire's interior came out and lined the streets of the Altepeme in which they stayed, to have their first look as the long-rumored strangers from afar, who had caused so much confusion and disorder already, passed by, looked upon by these naturales, who stared at them silently. These subjects of the Aztec Empire also would have surely noticed that the Tlaxcalan warriors walked unimpeded through the very heart of the lands of their most bitter rival. The people of this world knew that their lives were controlled as much by the politics of their day as they were by the whims of the gods, and in these strange tidings they undoubtedly saw both. And what of these Spaniards? It had been a year nearly to the day that they had followed Cortés as he defied Diego de Velázquez and set out on an expedition he was no longer legally entitled to. It had been 9 months since they had first landed in the Yucatan and made contact with the Maya. It had been 7 months since their first disastrous attempt at founding Veracruz. And it had been 5 months since they set out from the Gulf Coast on their march to Tenochtitlan. In all that time they had suffered and succeeded, terrorized and defeated their enemies. They had made alliances, they had squabbled amongst each other, they had schemed and conspired and attempted to manipulate those allegiances of their comrades to form factions which could dictate the aims of this expedition. Bernal Diaz had watched the Velazquista and Cortesista factions jockey for power and influence during the course of their march. Being a distant relation of Velázquez himself, Diaz may have started as a staunch supporter of the Cuban governor, but found himself, in his own telling, more sympathetic to Cortés's camp, and gambled on its success. Now, as they prepared to enter Mexico itself, it was a gamble that seemed to be paying off. Moctezuma sits in his war chamber. He meditates on the news he has received from one of his messengers, brought to him painted on the tree bark paper. The strangers, Teotl, have met his test in Cholula. At Moctezuma's orders, the Cholulans had refused the strangers the hospitality they had become accustomed to. With the collaboration of the barbarous Tlaxcalans, the strangers had massacred the Cholulans and sacked the Altepet. They are no great loss to Moctezuma, who sees these Cholulans as expendable in his greater plans to test the mettle of these strangers and stall for time. Moctezuma has not deliberated alone. The agony of these months has been shared by his council of closest advisors, including his brother Cuitláhuac and his nephew Cuauhtémoc. Cuitláhuac has spoken most strongly against this path, begging his brother to listen to reason. He warns Moctezuma not to allow into your house someone who will put you out of it. Cacamatzin, the Tlatoani of Texcoco installed by Moctezuma's own designs, is of a different mind, and says that these men have claimed to be emissaries of a great lord from beyond the sea, and must be afforded diplomatic custom. They cannot kill these men and risk a war with an enemy they do not yet understand. Bringing them closer, Cacamatzin argues, means that the Mexica can observe them in the light of Huitzilopochtli and out of the darkness of trickster gods who conspire against the hubris of mortals. My advice, Cacamatzin says, is that if you do not admit the embassy of a great lord such as the King of Spain appears to be, it is a low thing, since princes have the duty to hear the ambassadors of others. If they come dishonestly, you have in your court brave captains who can defend us. Moctezuma listens to the advice of all his ministers. His deliberation has been an agonizing one, and the time has come to make a formal decision. The strangers are to be admitted into Tenochtitlan. In an unprecedented move, Moctezuma will meet them on the southern causeway, removed from his palace. In a great irony, he dispatches Cuitláhuac to meet with them in Iztapalapa, the Altepet which Cuitláhuac is Tlatoani of. It is here that Cuitláhuac will officially extend the welcome, and Moctezuma makes his proclamation as such. "O mighty lords," says the emperor, "it is fitting that we the three of us should be here to receive the gods, and therefore I wish to find solace with you and also to bid you farewell. How little did we enjoy the realms which were bequeathed to us by our ancestors. They, mighty kings and lords as they were, left this place in peace and in harmony. But woe is coming to us. How do we deserve this fate? How did we offend the gods? Who are these men who have come? Whence have they really come? Who showed them the way? There is only one remedy. We must make our hearts strong to bear what is about to happen, for they are at our gates. The news sits uneasily with them all. Moctezuma has made his decision, and only time will tell what his decision will make of him. Meanwhile, the Spaniards crossed through the Altepeme of the valley, marveling continually at the dreamlike world that they had crossed into. The Spanish encounters with indigenous culture up to this point had been nothing like they saw now. The Taino and other peoples of the Caribbean had had their cultures and societies, but it had them of houses of sticks and mud, where the Nahua had their gleaming stone and neatly organized city streets. Even the Maya, which 3 separate Spanish expeditions had encountered, had been a society in decline, decaying as it had been since its classical period ended mysteriously hundreds of years prior. But now they were in the heart of an empire that was at its cultural and political zenith, achieving feats of engineering and cultural complexity that rivaled or exceeded even what these men had known back in Spain. They entered Iztapalapa and were treated hospitably, and told that the next day that Moctezuma would meet them in an audience on the causeway up to Tenochtitlan. Bernal Diaz remarked that the Spanish were amazed that half the houses of the Altepet seemed to be on land, while the other half were on water, and remarked that the men of these expedition were all offered a good supper that night. The next morning, that of the 8th of November, the expedition rose and prepared for their trek northward across the wide causeway. An emissary of Cacamatzin met Cortez and his captains to inform them that the Tlatoani of Texcoco, the second most important man in the empire, would be coming personally to meet with them before they set out on their journey. Cortez ordered his men to remain in their lodging, as Cacamatzin soon approached, carried on a litter by 4 of his servants, while others swept the ground in front of him as he approached. Cacamatzin descended from his litter and approached Cortez personally, who made a deep bow to the Lord. Bernal Diaz describes Cacamatzin's speech as saying, quote, "Malinche, we have come here, I and these chieftains, to place ourselves at your service, and to see that you receive everything you require for yourself and your companions, and to install you in our home, which is our city. For so we have been commanded by our Lord the great Moctezuma, who asks you to pardon him for not coming with us himself. It is on account of ill health, and not from lack of very good will towards you that he has not done so." Unquote. Malintzin replied on behalf of Cortez that he forgave Moctezuma for his absence, but added that they all hoped to see him soon, as the Spaniards, Castilteca she called them, came bearing important news about the one true God and their emperor from across the sea, who wished to be friends with this great Lord Moctezuma they had all heard so much about. Proper enough etiquette having been observed on both sides, Cacamatzin departed on his litter to rejoin Moctezuma farther ahead on the causeway. Cortez assembled his men and prepared them for the march up into Tenochtitlan. The conquistadores could barely comprehend their surroundings, let alone what was to come of them. Diaz remarked that the sheer diversity of trees and plants and birds astounded him, and as he wrote in his memoirs later, he thought that he didn't believe there was another land in all the world such as this. But now it was finally time to come face to face with Moctezuma himself and enter the great city. Diaz stands on the causeway of Iztapalapa, roughly a dozen meters wide, enough for several horsemen to ride side by side as they did now, impressing the naturales who had rumors of these beasts but still could not believe their eyes upon seeing them. But the moment was coming and the men were restless. Diaz, standing in back with the common soldiers, strains to hear Cortez as they stop, and he issues his last instructions to them before what was to come. Under no circumstances, he says, are they to show any surprise or emotion at all. Easier said than done, Diaz thinks, as the sheer scale of the audience and the city they approach overwhelms him. His heart falls to his stomach in these final moments of anticipation, the climax of all that had come since boarding their ships in Cuba and setting off to complete what Cordoba and Grijalva had started. The Spanish procession approached its endpoint, meeting the crowd which blocked its way further. Little did he know that they were standing at the same spot where the line of 80,000 sacrifices at the Templo Mayor had reached decades ago. The great lords of the city come out to meet Cortez, who steps forward with Malintzin at his side. Bernal Diaz watches as the caciques kneel down and mimic the scooping of dirt from the ground to move to their mouths. The ritual is incomprehensible to Diaz, though Cortez seems to have endless patience for it, as the lords repeat the gesture one by one, taking nearly an hour to do so. And it's only after this ritual begins to end that the mood of the meeting changes. The lords look behind them and part ways as a magnificent litter, carried by several men, moves forward. Bejeweled and befeathered, it impresses the Spaniards mightily, as does the lord inside. A stern-looking man with piercing eyes and neatly trimmed hair and goatee, this great emperor must be none other than Moctezuma. Diaz catches his breath and feels his heart pounding in his ears. The litter stops ahead of Cortez. Moctezuma dismounts and stands before them all. He's wearing sandals, in contrast to everyone else who stands there barefooted. Servants sweep the ground before him as he walks forward to greet Cortez. Diaz now watches from over the shoulders of those in front of him as Cortez seizes the initiative and moves to embrace Moctezuma. The mood raises sharply as caciques step forward to prevent Cortez from approaching. A misunderstanding that quickly threatens to spoil the mood. Moctezuma, however, dismisses them and allows the embrace of the stranger. Diaz notes that this seems to make the naturales quite uneasy. Cortez and Moctezuma begin to speak through Malintzin, but Diaz cannot hear what they are saying. He is not the intended audience. Later, stories will be told of what was said, and Diaz will rely on Cortez's words himself to draft his history of this moment. But for now, it exists entirely out of earshot. A few awkward moments pass. No one seems certain what to do next. Moctezuma seems to stare into Cortez, with a mixture of diplomatic friendliness and equally diplomatic calculation. He then gestures to the city behind him, an apparent invitation to come inside. The naturales split, opening a path forward. Cortez beckons to his men to follow, and they proceed up the causeway and toward this magnificent city of dreams. Diaz finds the experience incommunicable. Both the Spaniards and the Mexica must have marveled at the sights they were now seeing. The Spaniards took in the glory of Tenochtitlan firsthand. Those who would write about this moment later in life would invariably describe the city as indescribable. Most of these men were from small towns, well outside the urban centers of European life, and had never even conceived of a city as large as Tenochtitlan. Bernal Diaz, for his part, fawned over the lushness of the buildings, each of which seemed to be as much a garden as a structure in itself. The canals and bridges which crisscrossed the city reminded the men of Venice, or at least reminded them of descriptions they had heard of Venice, for few of them had actually been to the Italian Republic itself. The Mexica marveled not just at the strangeness of these Spanish men with fair skin and beards, but also at the fact that they had come into the city armed, something entirely forbidden to all, with no prior exception. The presence of the Tlaxcalans was also incredible to them. These barbarians they had fought against so viciously for so long were now being allowed straight into the empire itself, armed like vandals, ready to ransack the city. Moctezuma played the part of Aztec host impeccably, displaying the famed Nahua sense of hospitality to his guests. He led them to the palace of Axayacatl, his father's, and its quarters, and said that they must need their rest, and left them for his own palace. The Spaniards marveled at the construction of this, and its seemingly infinite number of rooms and evidence of Mexica craftsmanship on display throughout. The men regrouped and tried to take account of what they had just witnessed. The significance of the meeting was not lost on them, brief as it had been, and the sheer overpowering presence of Tenochtitlan all around them made their heads spin. Organized though it was along a grid system, it must have seemed a labyrinth to the Spaniards. Cortez ordered that none of the men were to leave the palace and wander the city alone, that they were all to act as though they were still on guard. Diaz, Cortez, and many of the Spaniards had not failed to note that, for all its beauty, Tenochtitlan was a tactical nightmare. Their success in battle had rested on the overpowering nature of the cavalry, a tactic now useless in the narrow streets of the city. It was slowly beginning to occur to some of the more perceptive men that they might not be guests of the emperor at all, but prisoners, and their moods clouded. For now, however, Moctezuma ordered that they be provisioned with food and water and comfort, whatever was necessary to appease them. The men rested briefly before Cortez took some of his closest captains, Malintzin, and 5 soldiers with him to go to Moctezuma's palace for a formal conversation. It is not clear whether Bernal Diaz was present at this meeting. It seems unlikely that Cortez would have found it important to bring him, though he certainly writes about it as though he were there. The story goes that Cortez went to the palace, where he was received amicably by Moctezuma, welcomed in with the usual speeches made. According to Diaz, Cortez then made a speech declaring that the Spaniards had come on behalf of the great Emperor Charles V, who wished to be friends with the Aztec lord and incorporate his kingdoms into his realm. It was, more or less, the same speech that Cortez made invariably to the lords of whatever Altepet he was in. Allegedly, Moctezuma responded with what is one of the most single-contested moments in the entire conquest's history. According to Cortez, Moctezuma then said, quote, "Long time have we been informed by the writings of our ancestors that neither myself nor any of those who inhabit this land are natives of it, but rather strangers who have come to it from foreign parts. We likewise know that from these parts our nation was led by a certain lord, to whom we are all subject, and who then went back to his native land, where he remained so long delaying his return, that at his coming those whom he had left had married the women of the land and had many children by them, and had built themselves cities in which they lived, so that they would in no wise return to their own land nor acknowledge him as lord, upon which he left them. And we have always believed that among his descendants one would surely come to subject this land and us as rightful vassals. Now seeing the regions from which you say you come, which is from where the sun rises, and the news you tell of this great king and ruler who sent you hither, we believe and hold it certain that he is our natural lord, especially in that you say he has long had knowledge of us. Wherefore be certain that we will obey you and hold you as lord in place of that great lord of whom you speak, in which service there shall be neither slackness nor deceit. And throughout all the land, that is to say all that I rule, you may command anything you desire, and it shall be obeyed and done. And all that we have is at your will and pleasure. And since you are in your own land and house, rejoice and take leisure from the fatigues of your journey and the battles you have fought. For I am well informed of all those you have been forced to engage in on your way here from Potonchan, as also the natives of Sempoal and Tlaxcala have told you many evil things of me. But believe no more than what you see with your own eyes, and especially not words from the lips of those who are my enemies, who were formerly my vassals, and on your coming rebelled against me, and said these things in order to find favor with you. I am aware, moreover, that they have told you that the walls of my houses were of gold, as was the matting on my floors, and other household articles, even that I was a god and claimed to be so, and other like matters. As for the houses, you see that they are of wood, stones, and earth. Upon this, Cortez says, he lifted his clothing, showing me his body, and said, And you see that I am of flesh and blood like yourself and everyone else, mortal and tangible. Unquote. Diaz also added to this that Cortez began evangelizing Christianity immediately, imploring that Moctezuma abandon his gods and convert on the spot with all of his usual zealotry. Often, Father Olmedo had dissuaded Cortez from being so blunt in his efforts of conversion, instead cautioning the captain that they should all wait until the proper moment came. This time, however, there was no Father Olmedo to remind Cortez for the need of tact. Instead, Cortez all but demanded Moctezuma accept his request. Moctezuma diplomatically replied, quote, My lord Malinche, these arguments of yours have been familiar to me for some time. I understand you said to my ambassadors on the sandhills about the 3 gods and the cross, also what you preached in the various towns through which you passed. We have given you no answer, since we have worshipped our own gods here from the beginning and know them to be good. No doubt yours are good also, but do not trouble to tell us any more about them at present. Regarding the creation of the world, we have held the same belief for many ages, and for this reason are certain that you are those who our ancestors predicted would come from the direction of the sunrise. As for your great king, I am in his debt, and will give him of what I possess. For, as I have already said, 2 years ago I had news of the captains who came in ships, by the road that you came, and said they were servants of this great king of yours. I should like to know if you are all the same people." Unquote. What Moctezuma actually said can never be known. The familiarity with some Mexica myths in the speech suggests that Moctezuma said maybe something along these lines. But it's also undoubtable that Cortés, always looking to write history as his own personal legal defense, lied about the extent of Moctezuma's submission. It seems more likely that Moctezuma, speaking the reverse register of High Nahuatl, was making claims of his own greatness and the sovereignty of his empire by speaking from a place of humility, that he was simply a caretaker of an obedient kingdom. Whether this would have been translated literally or functionally by Malinche to Cortés can never be known. But Cortés saw an opportunity where one was presented and feigned ignorance. And it was not as though Spanish did not have its own idioms of hospitality not to be taken literally, and that a phrase like "mi casa es su casa" did not literally state a transfer of ownership over a home. Moctezuma was playing his usual games of diplomacy. He was not handing over his empire. He knew that the Spanish had to be managed carefully, and if a statement of obedience and a perfunctory acceptance of vassal status meant that Cortés could be appeased for now, so be it. They were simply words, and the gulf between what was claimed and what was practiced was wide enough to give Moctezuma the latitude he still needed to operate. Later, Moctezuma would further attempt to endear himself to his unwanted guests by offering them even more tribute and treasure than they had already been afforded. The Spanish accepted these gifts with customary insolence and greed. Historian Camilla Townsend writes in Fifth Son that, quote, "Moctezuma treated the strangers, even the Tlaxcalan leaders, like honored guests, despite the drain on his resources that feeding so large a company entailed. He persistently questioned them through Malinche. The Spaniards toured the city, rudely demanding gifts everywhere they went. Their hosts remembered them chortling and slapping each other on the back when they saw Moctezuma's personal storehouse, and were told they could take what they liked. The Spaniards took beautiful gold jewelry and melted it down to make bricks. The Tlaxcalan warlords preferred polished jade. Moctezuma showed the strangers maps and tribute lists in an effort to get them to name their price and go away. He clearly hoped to convince them to leave and to have established the most favorable possible relationship with them by the time they did." Unquote. Moctezuma then gave Cortés some more gifts and thanked him for his visit. Cortés accepted the rules of hospitality required that he return to his own lodgings and obliged. It was the true first conversation of many shared between the two men to come. But the Spanish were not content to ransack the personal treasury of Moctezuma. They had come to conquer a kingdom, and the most cunning of the men wasted no time in conspiring. Back in the palace of Axayacat, which would be their home for several months, the men considered their options. As they did so, a Spanish carpenter noticed a seam in one of the walls. Cortés ordered it open and broken into, wherein they found an enormous room filled with treasures of all sorts accumulated during the reign of the previous Tlatoque. The men marveled at the sheer amount of treasure and estimated it at tens of thousands worth of pesos. Cortés ordered that the room be resealed and not spoken of again until the time was right to use this information. He believed that time was on the Spanish side, and in the meantime he wanted to know as much about the city as he could. After a few more days' stay in Tenochtitlan, in which the Spaniards rarely left the palace and did not travel far when they did, Cortés requested to see the temple in Tlatelolco and sent messengers to Moctezuma for permission, which was received. Moctezuma also insisted that he accompany the Spanish to that temple. Cortés and his men wandered through Tenochtitlan for the first time since arriving in the city, continuing to marvel at all they could see and make tactical notes of how to fight in such an urban setting as this. Streets hardly big enough for two men to stand shoulder to shoulder alternated with the wide, grand avenues that dissected the city into its major calpulli. The city teemed with activity. Houses were organized around square courtyards and had flat roofs and walls reinforced by mud and housed a dozen or more people each. Gardens grew from them, and animals like turkey, dogs, and other small creatures lived with the families, who fattened them up to be eaten later. Children roamed the streets playing games while women sat at their hearth and baked tortillas to be eaten in the 2 daily meals of the Aztecs. The Spanish also noted the sheer number of prostitutes which lined the streets. Cortés would take constant notes, scribbling down any number of observations to be recorded for later. Once again, hygiene standards differentiated the Spaniards from their indigenous counterparts. The Mexica bathed daily, routinely, and obsessively. The Spaniards insisted it was a sin of vanity to bathe, and stank. Before they approached the pyramid, they were shown the great market of Tlatelolco, that subjugated sister city of Tenochtitlan. The market was the largest such in the Americas, and the biggest that the Spanish had ever seen. Diaz in particular stood in awe and recounts at length in his memoir all the ways in which the market was organized neatly into stalls which sold every conceivable good imaginable in the empire. There was, of course, gold and silver, but also all kinds of fruits and vegetables and meats, as well as textiles and all examples of crafted goods. In his descriptions of the market, Diaz relates that it would be impossible to know everything that was for sale there, though he certainly does try for pages and pages. Trade was made in equivalents of cocoa beans or bolts of cloth, and prices were strictly enforced by judges who oversaw everything. Anyone found to be attempting to cheat in weights or prices was swiftly put to death. The Spanish and Mexica then went to the Great Pyramid in Tlatelolco. Moctezuma, who had joined the Spanish while being carried in his litter, descended from it to walk on foot as he approached the base, keeping in good custom. He and the Spanish then ascended to the top of the pyramid in its 100-plus steep steps, made so vertically that the drop of sacrificed bodies could not be impeded. As they made it to the top, Moctezuma noticed that Cortez and his men seemed to be gasping for air and asked if they were tired. The men were also dealing with painful sores on their legs from sleeping and fighting so roughly. Cortez replied that Spaniards were never tired, a remark that surely amused Moctezuma. From there, the Spaniards were able to see the city in its near entirety. They stood in awe at the size and organization of it all, as well as the enormity of the pyramid which they had ascended. They also made note of the 3 causeways that led out of Tenochtitlan and the approximate distances to the mainland. They also saw the sheer number of canoes that paddled across the lake. Diaz noted that the men noticed that the causeways leading in and out of the cities could be raised, trapping them inside at any point. Many of the soldiers likened their situation to being caught in a spider web, and uncertainty and paranoia began to take hold of these men in the Aztec capital. Moctezuma then showed Cortez the altar in which victims were sacrificed before idols of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, fearsome idols that the Spaniards found to be terrifying as well as heretical. The room in which they were housed was coated near black in the layers of blood that had dried across innumerable killings, and the Spanish became sick at the smell of it, and the priests who were covered in blood so thoroughly that their hair was mottled together in thick chunks. At every step of this presentation of his gods, Moctezuma consulted with his priests to make sure that all was in order. Cortez asked Father Olmedo if now would be a good time to once again explain Christianity to Moctezuma, who had heard it once before directly, but was also aware of the Spanish gods from the reports he had gathered for months. Olmedo said that it would be a fine thing if he was successful, but cautioned that now might not be the best time. Cortez shrugged off this advice, and once again launched into a speech about how these things were not gods, but devils, and that a lord as great as Moctezuma must be able to see that. Moctezuma, in a flash of the anger he was known for among his people, upbraided Cortez, saying that if he had known the Spanish would be so insulting to his gods, he never would have brought them to see them. Cortez backed down, aware that he had made a diplomatic mistake, and then requested that they descend the pyramid and visit the market once again. After, the Spanish returned to their quarters and held a mass of their own. Earlier, Cortez had requested to build a Christian altar atop the pyramid, but was rebuffed. He then requested that they be allowed to build one in the palace in which they stayed. Moctezuma found this acceptable, and so it was built. And it's here we approach another fork in the historical road, one whose paths each work hard to obscure the sight of the other. What happened next between the Spaniards and Moctezuma is told in conflicting, oftentimes incomprehensible accounts, and how you see it largely determines your overall assessment of the Spanish-Aztec War. According to Diaz, it was after seeing the true extent of their isolation in Tenochtitlan that the men consulted with Cortez and conspired to do something about it. The plan was one which had been practiced in Spanish dealings with the indigenous since the beginning of their conquests: capture indigenous rulers to better control their people. The plan was that armed men would go to Moctezuma's palace and seize him, placing him under arrest and puppeting the government of Tenochtitlan. Diaz then writes that this is indeed what happened, that the Spanish at this time had received news from the coast that the Mexica had attacked the men the Spanish had left behind in Veracruz, killing one of them. The attack had not only shaken the Spanish, but provoked their Sempoalan allies, who, learning of a Spanish defeat, quickly changed sides once again and were ungovernable by the Spaniards. Cortés used this as pretext. He went to Moctezuma and made the preambulatory speeches he usually did before announcing his disappointment at the news that Moctezuma had ordered an attack on them, and that Cortés was aware that this was not the first time, citing the Mexica armies that were rumored to be waiting outside of Cholula at the time of the Spanish arrival in that city. He then went on to explain to Moctezuma that it was necessary that the Spanish arrest him for his safety and theirs. Moctezuma was dumbfounded and explained that such a thing was impossible, offering every alternative, including the use of some of his children as Spanish hostages. Diaz writes that Cortés remained firm, but some of the captains, getting antsy about the back and forth that was dragging out what was meant to be a quick arrest, suggested that they simply kill Moctezuma and get it all over with. Diaz then writes that Malintzin turned to Moctezuma and explained there was simply no way out of this, and that to resist would only add to the burdens that Moctezuma would face. Defeated, Moctezuma is supposed to have allowed himself to be accompanied with his servants and ministers back to the palace of Axayacatl, where he would stay as a Spanish prisoner for the next 6 months, governing his city as a puppet of Cortés. Nearly all of what recorded history tells us happened next comes from Cortés's letters and Diaz's memoir. In Cortés's second letter, he argues that he arrested Moctezuma for being technically in rebellion to the king he had earlier pledged himself as vassal to. This was meant to be legal pretext for seizing the Altepet altogether, in a way that made Cortés's actions legally defensible, rather than an outrageous breach of conduct that it truly would have been. Diaz does little to contradict this account, writing decades later that though Moctezuma howled with indignity at what was being done to him, the Spaniards were well within their rights and acting rationally. This account of the Tenochtitlan captivity has dominated history ever since, explaining across centuries how Cortés and his men were able to live in luxury at the heart of the evil empire that began to conquer from the inside out. But the letter of history often obscures its lived experience. While there is no doubt that Moctezuma was eventually taken captive, it's now thought that this only happened much later, when dramatic events forced Cortés's hands as the Spaniards' control over the situation began to deteriorate. Far from a show of strength, it was a belated act of desperation that, ironically, ensured the bloody conflict that would soon follow. Historian Camilla Townsend casts serious doubt on the capture of Moctezuma happening so early in the Spanish residency. She points out that the conquistadores themselves wrote confusingly of this period in hindsight, and that Moctezuma continued to govern as though he were Tlatoani, which, of course, he was, and not a Spanish prisoner. What was heralded by the Spanish and passed down to history, the bold and heroic seizing of an emperor, seems instead to have been a Spanish rhetorical invention, something which was not written as what was in order to build a better case for their illegal expedition. Whatever is said to have occurred on that day in mid-November, the next several months played out in a way that revealed the complex nature of diplomacy and power between the Spanish and Moctezuma in the first part of their occupation in Tenochtitlan. The supposed perpetrators of the Mexica attack on the Spanish were brought back to Tenochtitlan, where Cortés interrogated them and tortured them for a confession. When he had the information he thought was proof enough of their complicity, he had them tied to a stake and burned in the temple district of Tenochtitlan. The Mexica, who routinely witnessed human sacrifices in this very square, were still horrified at the Spanish method for doing so, and some of them, at least those who had heard of the Spaniards' constant objection to Aztec sacrifice, may have noted the hypocrisy of opposing one form of sacrifice and replacing it with another. Whether this irony ever occurred to the Spanish has not been recorded. The bodies of the Mexica scapegoats were incinerated and tensions eased. Moctezuma continued to show the Spaniards around the city, introducing them to his aviary and zoo where he kept his collection of wild animals that so deeply impressed Bernal Diaz. The whole of the city continued to astound the conquistador, as well as the opulence of its emperor. Diaz wrote of the way in which the emperor bathed daily, oftentimes twice, wore 4 separate garments throughout the day, ate from Cholulan pottery that was never reused, and served endless amounts of food that he would only take a few bites of before passing over. It was a level of excess and luxury the Spanish could not even fathom. Moctezuma also continued to exercise more subtle diplomacy. He had offered some of his daughters to the Spaniards as gifts, another set of women in the long line of them given over to the Spanish as a prize along their journeys. Moctezuma was testing them. If they married the daughters, it would be considered a good sign, a desire for political alliance. If they simply held them as concubines, it would be a much darker omen. The Spanish baptized one of these daughters, Tecuichpotzin, and christened her Isabel. She was not married to the Spanish, none of them were. Instead, like so many others, most of these women were held as property and raped. As the months went by, each side continued to test the resolve and intentions of the other. Diaz writes that Moctezuma came to know the Spanish individually throughout this period, right down to their individual personalities. Giving gifts, he would be felt most appreciated by each man. Diaz recounts of his own relationship with Moctezuma and how he had once requested a Mexica woman. Quote, "When Moctezuma received this message, he sent for me and said, 'Bernal Diaz del Castillo, they say that you are short of clothes and gold. But today I will tell them to give you a fine girl. Treat her well, for she is the daughter of an important man, and they will give you gold and cloaks as well.' I answered him most deferentially that I kissed his hands for the favor, and hoped that our Lord God might prosper him." Unquote. Moctezuma is also reported to have visited his wives and innumerable concubines in his own palace throughout these months. Hardly the actions of an imprisoned man. The emperor also continued to be devoted to his gods during this period, despite the incessant evangelizing of Cortez. Cortez claims that during this time he had commanded that Moctezuma cease human sacrifices. Bernal Diaz, however, notes that, quote, "Moctezuma told Cortez he wished to go visit his temple and make sacrifices and pay the necessary devotion to his gods." Unquote. The sacrifices to the gods were a way of Moctezuma establishing order in a world that had ceased to be easily understood. Another such method was through games. The Tlatoani had a gambling streak to match Cortez's, and the two men frequently played a game of chance known as Totoloque. Each man had another keep score for him. Moctezuma, one of his servants, and Cortez used Pedro de Alvarado. Alvarado was known to cheat in favor of Cortez, which Moctezuma noted with amusement. The two men gambled gold and jewels. When Moctezuma won, he gave his winnings to Cortez's men. When Cortez won, he gave his winning to Moctezuma's. Games of chance were of special importance to Moctezuma. They also offer a window into the Tlatoani's thinking during this time. In his book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, David Graeber takes time to examine the ways in which rare strokes of luck and exceptional circumstances were interpreted by the Mexica in games. Quote, "Aztec games tended to have a peculiar feature. There was almost always a way that by a freak stroke of luck one could achieve total victory. This seems to have been true, for instance, of their famous ball games. Observers always wonder, viewing the tiny stone hoops set up high above the court, how anyone could ever possibly have managed to score. The answer seems to be they didn't, at least not that way. Normally, the game had nothing to do with the hoop. The game was played between two opposing squads, attired as for battle, knocking the ball back and forth. A normal method of scoring was through the slow accumulation of points, but that process could be dramatically preempted. To send the ball through one of the rings, a feat, given the size of the ball in the ring, presumably rarer than a hole-in-one in golf, gave instant victory, ownership of all the goods wagered, and the right to pillage the cloaks of the onlookers." Unquote. Graeber continues on to argue that, for Moctezuma, these were strange days indeed, and that in times like these it was important to be on the lookout for even more exceptional circumstances. In Totoloque, if a die were to land on its edge instead of one of the faces, it was another moment in which the player won everything. Perhaps then this was what Moctezuma was waiting for in all his time spent in the Spanish company. Such a moment that the circumstances would land on the die's edge and Moctezuma would win it all. It seemed that the Tlatoani had staked everything on such a moment happening, and when it didn't, quote, "Cortez continued to cheat, the gods sent no revelation, and the universe was eventually destroyed." Unquote. All was not well within the empire, however. As Moctezuma spent much of his time absorbed with his quasi-captivity with the Spanish, dissent was fomenting among the other Altopeme of his empire. Months passed, and the intrusion of the Spanish was becoming less welcome among others. A conspiracy was afoot, led by Cacamatzin. Cacamatzin, again, was Moctezuma's nephew and the Tlatoani of Texcoco by virtue of Moctezuma's intervention in Texcoco's civil war after the death of Nezahualpilli. Texcoco was the most important ally for Tenochtitlan. Without it, Tenochtitlan lacked legitimacy and security in its position as the seat of an empire. Cacamatzin had once been one of the most loyal supporters of Moctezuma, but found his hospitality toward the Spanish now intolerable. His position in Texcoco was tenuous against his brother, with Moctezuma distracted by the Spanish occupation, and Cacamatzin believed that if his uncle would not rule properly as Tlatoani, it was his right to inherit the royal reedmat. The inciting incident seems to have been a moment of misunderstanding at the tomb of Nezahualcoyotl, the deceased philosopher king of Texcoco and the grandfather of Cacamatzin. An incident where panicked Spanish seized a messenger and hanged them by Cortez's orders on suspicion of rebellion. Cacamatzin called together a meeting with various leaders of the empire, including the Tlatelolco of Tlacopan and Iztapalapa. They plotted a scheme to remove Moctezuma from power and install Cacamatzin, but infighting over the succession of the Huey Tlatoani title caused a fracture in this alliance, a fracture which resulted in the jilted parties leaking news of the scheme back to Moctezuma. It seems that Cacamatzin's brother and rival claimant as Texcoco's Tlatoani, Ixtlilxochitl, not only revealed the plot, but tricked Cacamatzin into a canoe under his command and delivered him personally to the Spanish in Tenochtitlan, which was, of course, revenge against Moctezuma for backing his brother over himself. Now a prisoner of the Spanish, Cacamatzin attempted to ransom himself with Texcocan gold. The Spanish collected tens of thousands of worth of pesos from Texcoco, but it was not enough, and Cortez ordered Pedro de Alvarado to bring Cacamatzin to Texcoco for more gold. Alvarado was found later by the Spanish torturing Cacamatzin with hot coals burning his feet while tied to a stake. This netted Alvarado nearly 9,000 more pesos of gold. The would-be uprising of Cacamatzin proved to be too much for Cortez, who now sought to deliver on his claim of imprisoning an emperor. But it was not enough to have Moctezuma alone. As Cortez saw, rival claimants might spring up and launch a rebellion. Cortez had Moctezuma summon the other lords of the land, and, in a speech confirmed later by Cortez's many enemies as well as friends, recalled how he had Moctezuma accept formal vassalage of the Aztec Empire to the Spanish one, and how all the other lords had relented. This acceptance of vassalage was, of course, accompanied by more Spanish demands for gold. They looted the city for more of it, taking it from places they had not already done so. And it was not only the gold they were after. They seized many more daughters of the lords. The Spanish violated these royal hostages repeatedly. Cortez added insult to injury, summoning the pyramids and breaking the idols of Mexica gods to make room for a Christian altar in its place. The Spanish capped off their coup over the control of the city by seizing both the political and spiritual centers. To the Mexica, these elements were one and the same. Spanish loot was taken into account and distributed. 160,000 pesos worth had been seized, not including other treasures like featherwork and armor. The royal fifth was set aside before Cortez took control of over 25,000 pesos himself, in addition to further funds to reimburse himself for his expenditures on the expedition. It seems that no money was set aside for reimbursing Diego Velázquez for his expenditures in this same expedition. And when it was all said and done, Spanish officers received 500 pesos and common conquistadores about 100. They felt insulted. Cortez managed to pay off the most vocal dissenters. The Tlaxcalan allies, the unstated force which kept the Spanish in power, received none, nor did the Taino and African slaves. In retrospect, the Mexica attack on the men of Veracruz must have been the beginning of the end, even if it took months to play out. Diaz writes that in response to this event, Cortez sent Gonzalo de Sandoval, the conquistador boy wonder, with a few men to reestablish control of the town and the Sempoalans in rebellion. The conquistador in charge of Veracruz since the attack by the Mexica, Alonso de Grado, had succumbed to delusions of grandeur and harassed his Sempoalan allies incessantly for treasures and women. Sandoval was to replace him and send him back to Tenochtitlan in irons, where Cortez would then put him in the stocks. This was the incident that had kicked off additional tensions between the Spanish and Moctezuma, and, allegedly, though likely falsely, the moment pegged in retrospect when Cortez placed Moctezuma in chains. Whatever really happened, the attack on Veracruz and the execution of the perpetrators by the Spanish showed just how high the stakes were in this delicate power struggle. Cortez had sent Sandoval with instructions to send back Tenochtitlan blacksmiths and all the materials from the dismantled ships. These soon reached the city, where Cortez then ordered a young carpenter from Seville, Martin Lopez, to use the materials and oversee the construction of 4 brigantines he would use on the lake. They were soon built, and Cortez used them to survey Lake Texcoco, sometimes bringing Moctezuma along to impress the Tlatoani and accompany him on hunts across the lake. Cortez and his captains understood that control of Tenochtitlan was impossible without a naval force. They had noted the 3 causeways which led out of the city and the hundreds of canoes used by the natives. Were a fight to break out, the Spanish would be quickly surrounded without a way of escaping. The use of these ships was meant to be insurance against this very occurrence. Cortez asked Moctezuma for a survey of the empire, including locations of gold and silver mines, which Moctezuma duly provided. Cortez then sent men to scout each of these areas firsthand and report back to him their findings, which they did duly. All the while, Cortez continued to survey Tenochtitlan and the surrounding lakes for information about strategic considerations. During this time, it became clear to Moctezuma that the Spaniards were not interested in leaving. Over time, he began to ask Cortez when he thought the Spanish might move on. Cortez insisted the Spanish could not return without ships on the coast, eliding the fact that he had already managed to build them in Lake Texcoco. But the tensions were building, and no one involved seemed to have an exit strategy for how they were going to resolve the confusion over who was really in charge. It seemed to be a stalemate of interest that had settled on Tenochtitlan. And like many stalemates, it was more fragile than it appeared, relying as it did on each side maintaining its relative positions while the stakes remained frozen. Cortez and the Spanish could not seize all of Tenochtitlan, even with their allies in technological superiority. But Moctezuma couldn't eject the Spanish either. Each one continued to bide their time waiting for a moment to reveal itself that would allow one side or the other to break through. Bernal Diaz was not one of the principal decision-makers of this delicate era, but he witnessed, or at least claimed to witness, many of the most important events of this time period. At the meeting on the southern causeway outside of Tenochtitlan, he witnessed the moment of grandiose history playing out awkwardly between the 2 men who more than anyone else defined the meeting of 2 worlds. He also bared witness to those initial days of exuberance and confusion, giving away to the paranoid reality that the prize that the Spanish sought in Tenochtitlan could just as easily be a trap of their own hubris and ambition. Diaz also joined in the historical conspiracy of how and when Moctezuma's captivity took place, perpetuating one of the greatest lies in this time period in service of legal hand-waving and justification for later crimes. But these were crimes that the Spanish would not immediately pay for. And as that first half-year marched on, no one could foresee the tragic consequences for everyone involved that would eventually be the price paid. Next week, we will examine the force that broke the stalemate wide open and forced Cortez and Moctezuma into a new calculus of power, one which wouldn't be nearly so stable, and would see the days of peace in Tenochtitlan come to an end. And that's because next week, we're going to see exactly what Diego Velázquez has been up to since we last saw him, and meet the man he deputized to enforce his revenge against Cortez, Pánfilo de Narváez. And so that's all for this episode of Can't Go Back, Won't Move On. Written, narrated, and produced by Gavrilo Z, with music composed and performed by Jake Krasiniak. If you like the show, tell your friends. All my listeners are appreciated, and I hope you're enjoying it. Goodbye.